Hey everybody, welcome back to A Good Run podcast with Daniel Feldman. I'm Asher Feldman, introducing episode 10, a discussion about Allard Lowenstein between Leah and Dan. This was recorded shortly before New Year's, and we're coming back to you on Inauguration Day. So a little bit of counter-programming here, if you're so inclined. Thanks for sticking with us during the break. We're hoping to have some more regular podcast episodes posted every other week for the foreseeable future. Remember to follow us on Twitter or on your favorite podcasting app and on our blog to get new episodes just as soon as they post. Thanks everybody, and enjoy this episode with Dan and Leah.
Welcome to A Good Run. This is Leah Feldman. I'm here with Dan Feldman, and we're recording the 10th episode of A Good Run. Today, we are going to be talking about something that you spoke briefly about during your last podcast, but someone who's appropriately important to you to maybe cover more than one, Mr. Al Lowenstein. Do you want to just talk briefly a little bit about the beginning of your relationship with Mr. Lowenstein, how you mentioned in your podcast you sort of didn't give him much of a choice in your approach to work for him?
Right. Well, as I mentioned last time, in my first year at law school, I was doing a lot of things to avoid studying for law school, and one of them was hanging around what's called the Kennedy Institute of Politics, which is associated with the Kennedy School of Government, but it's a less formal institution. And Al Lowenstein came up to speak. I had never met him before, but I did remember my mother had heard him on the radio, I guess, and had said, "This guy's brilliant. If you ever get a chance to hear him, you should." And so I did. And as I mentioned, I was standing in the back of a long, crowded room, and Lowenstein spoke at great length. It was probably 40 minutes or maybe more. And at the end of that talk, I just simply walked all the way up to the front of the room, approached him and said, "I will be working for you this summer." I have never reacted that way to any political speaker before or since. And I have had occasion to interact with the Clintons, and I've certainly heard Kennedys and Reagan and all those folks, and none of them ever remotely affected me the way Lowenstein did. Lowenstein was an extraordinary figure. He was the only white person on the board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Martin Luther King, and was very centrally involved in the Civil Rights Movement. He was the leader of the anti-war movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement. He did many other very remarkable things in his career. I'll probably have a chance to talk about some of them later. But his only elective office was one term in Congress, but he accomplished a phenomenal amount in his all too brief lifetime. He was assassinated at age 50. But in any case, I did indeed work for Al Lowenstein. That's what I meant when I said that to him. Was I don't care if you pay me. I'll eat grass off people's lawns. I'm working for you.
So even in your blog, you do mention that you had occasion to speak to some well-noted, effective and important speakers, whether political or otherwise, such as Bill Clinton and several of the Kennedys. Yeah. And although your political stances differ, Ronald Reagan was noted as a wonderful speaker. Right. What was the substance of the speech that he gave that really affected you so entirely? Well,
the moment, the year was either fall of 70 or spring of 71, I don't remember which, and that was a period during the Vietnam War. The amendment allowing 18-year-olds to vote had recently become law, so he was talking about registering a lot of 18-year-olds in preparation for the 1972 election, and his theory, which of course did not work out, was that we would register enough young people to be sure to defeat Richard Nixon in 72, thinking that the young people would be overwhelmingly anti-war and so forth. Didn't work out that way, but Al was just a brilliant, not only, I shouldn't say a brilliant speaker, yes, but he was such a brilliant guy that when he spoke, it was just, everything he said was so intelligent that, there was passion there too, but tremendous intelligence and wide-ranging intellect. And the guy was just such a brilliant guy that, for me and for many others, he was spellbinding. Actually, it was kind of a standing joke in my generation. And when I say my generation, I mean college educated, my cohort, so to speak, demographic cohort, that, you didn't work for Al Lowenstein. What was wrong with you? Almost everybody did at some point or other.
You think because he was such a talented orator and because his thoughts, his stances were progressive and intelligent in the way that many college-educated students might have.
All that is true, and yes, all that is part of the reason. The other part of the reason is that he had unbelievable energy, so that he knew everybody. I mean, it was wherever you would go in the country, there were thousands of people that knew Al Lowenstein. As an organizer, he just interacted with so many people that he just knew people every place, and not just in the United States, by the way, all over the world. He was just he was a whirling dervish of energy.
Did he have particular stances on global issues in addition to?
Well, he personally, at enormous personal risk, smuggled an anti-apartheid activist out of South Africa by car.
Wow! My gosh!
This was Al. He just did everything all over the place.
And what do you think? I mean, with energy of that extent, I mean, and I also think that in order for someone to have made such an impact on so many people, the energy and the sort of effectiveness has to be motivated by something very deep-seated.
Well, Al was very passionately committed to justice, to fighting injustice.
So this fire was fueled by a simple desire to fight injustice.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I could see why that would be appealing, especially if someone is you. So in your blog, we first hear, you walking into the Kennedy Center and, hearing this speech and really finding yourself totally and completely committed to Al Lowenstein's campaign. And then a bit later on, we then find you, loaning him cash, trading sports jackets when his were wrinkled or crumpled, or, driving him places, probably, 24 hours around the clock. So, what struck me as interesting about that is that there has long been a sort of divide, or, a sort of projected divide between the face that politicians and the persona politicians put forward in the public eye, and then that which they are in the private realm. And I would imagine that in such close proximity to Al in so many different atmospheres, you would have seen not only his public figure but his private figure, and basically every shade that he has. Did you notice a sort of difference between Al Lowenstein on stage and Al Lowenstein in the passenger seat of your car?
No. That's not to say that I didn't see things that were in some way disturbing, but they were absolutely of a piece. That is, for example, he would frequently, I'd be with him at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock at night, and he'd call Jenny, his wife, and say, "Oh, Jenny, I'm bringing, there are 7 people coming over for dinner tonight, probably some of them will stay over." I mean, because he would just pick up people, he'd talk to somebody, they'd be interesting, they would, often they would be mesmerized by him, and suddenly he'd have another assistant, and he would just, give his wife no notice, and, at the last minute bring a bunch of people that she'd put up with this. But I mean, but his what he saw as his mission, was, I guess, stronger than anything personal. So he just assumed that people would just, drop whatever they were doing. And as a matter of fact, your mother, my wife, had a very different reaction to Al than I did. She worked for Al before I did.
Oh.
And while I did. But because he would think nothing of calling you at any hour and saying, "Oh, please come help, I need you." essentially drop whatever you're doing and come work for me. Cecilia felt that she didn't like the fact that she saw it as a kind of egocentrism, that whatever he was doing was more important than whatever you were doing, and you should understand that you should drop whatever you're doing and come work for Al. Now, as a person who was a professional politician myself for a while, I think I have more sympathy with that. It's almost, if you feel, in a sense, if you're a politician who is fervently fighting for what you believe is justice, you kind of have to do that. I mean, the odds against you are enormous. You need all the help you can get. Anyone who's willing to help you, you want their help, and your attitude sort of has to be, what I'm doing is really important. Drop what you're doing and come help me. But Mom is more of a human being, I guess, and I sympathize more with the politician. So that never bothered me about Al. I mean, she was a devoted Al person until she wouldn't put up with it anymore. I have a life. I'm not just going to drop everything, come work for you.
Well, I mean, I wonder what it is that. So for you, if you were in the middle of, I don't know, shining your shoes, and then Al Lowenstein called you and said, "Please come over. I need your help." The motivation for dropping your shoes and going over to Al was that in this fight for what is right, you need everything and all the help you can get, and you were willing to put aside whatever it was you were doing in order to help support that.
A couple of years later, when I was doing something entirely else, wasn't working for Al. I don't know what I was doing, but it had nothing to do with Al. It was during the summer, and it was on a weekend, and my father said, "Oh, you have a message. Al is going to run for mayor, and he's announcing at so and such a time. I'd like you to be there." Al there was no way on earth, and it made no sense. He wasn't living in New York. I mean, I immediately dropped what I was doing and went to some convention center. Turned out it was Al Blumenthal. I didn't know from Adam.
No.
But if Al Lowenstein wanted me there, I was going to be there. So
I guess I still want to know a little more about where that total and complete allegiance comes from. Where, how can you rightfully, as a, well-educated, independent person yourself, swear yourself so entirely to someone?
I never met anyone with a combination of the passion for justice, the phenomenal intelligence, and the unbelievable energy that Al combined. He just, to me, he was my political idol. Still is.
Well, unfortunately, what that brings me to next is something that's not so pleasant, but he was assassinated at a very young age.
Well, he was 50. Yeah.
50 is quite young.
Yeah, I know. A lot younger than I am now.
Yeah. Beyond his role in your mind as your political hero and someone whose moral compass was inspiring to you, he must have been a friend. I mean,
yes, he was.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of hours the two of you spent together, you don't, trade sports jackets with someone unless you consider them your friend.
No, actually, when I announced for city council in '73, there were two former and current elected officials who attended my fundraiser. One was Liz Holtzman, and the other was Al Lowenstein. And my race was also a ridiculously uphill race, but these two were very loyal.
So can you talk a bit about what?
Well, Al was assassinated by a mentally ill person named Patrick Sweeney, who had worked for Al, but who was psychotic. And there was no, it was complete, it wasn't political. I mean, it was political in the sense that the guy had some conspiracy fantasy, but the guy was mentally ill. That was all there was to it. And I'll never forget that night. Al was a very strong guy. I mean, he worked out. He was in great shape, and he'd been shot in the head. But he didn't die right away, and there was some hope that he might survive. And a bunch of us, including one moderately famous actor, Bob Balaban. He's a pretty famous actor. Had worked for Al, and a number of us who had worked for him were there at the hospital as sort of a vigil, hoping that he would survive, and of course he didn't. But sometime later there was a memorial service for Al, in which Ted Kennedy spoke. And Ted Kennedy said something very interesting. Al had, as I may have mentioned, Al had been elected to Congress. He served one term, during which he basically ended voice voting because those were non-recorded votes.
I'm sorry, voice vote?
Yeah, where the speaker would say all in favor, aye, all opposed, nay, and so because it wasn't recorded, nobody knew who had voted for what. They could get away with anything.
Yeah.
Al assigned two of his volunteers to each of the 450 members of Congress, 900 volunteers, to witness which way they would vote on the voice vote, on the vote he pushed through on ending voice voting. Thus ending it.
Yes.
For which, as you can imagine, the other members of Congress were not very grateful.
Sure.
And so apparently none of the leadership of either party was all that upset when they redrew his district in a way that added like a zillion Republicans. He still almost won. But he was always desperate to get back into Congress. In fact, one of the campaigns, the only congressional campaign of his that I was involved in at all, was a rerun of a campaign against John Rooney where he ran in Brooklyn. Actually, maybe we'll get to that when we talk about another race, because that's for another podcast. But in any case, Al was always trying to get back into Congress, and meanwhile, he was one of Jimmy Carter's representatives to the United Nations, where he orchestrated the liberation of Rhodesia. I mean, he did all kinds of things, and he's still doing a million valuable things. And so at the memorial service, Ted Kennedy talked about how he had spoken with Al on the phone not that long ago. And he mentioned to Al that this particular member of Congress, I think from California, I don't remember who it was, had been saying what a great job Al was doing. So Al said, "Oh, gee, I apologize, but I don't know that member of Congress." And Kennedy said, I said to him, "Al, he's a member of Congress, but he knows who you are." Point being, you don't have to be in Congress. You're Al Lowenstein.
Yeah.
You know? So it was he was just a towering figure.
Yeah.
Great.
So what do you think made him so interested? I mean, I understand, being part of Congress is, important for.
Why was he so anxious to be in Congress?
Yeah.
Oh, I think he thought it would give him some kind of validation. Maybe he was just, I don't know, worried about having a platform. Having an income might be useful. I mean, he was always raising money to support what he was doing. Yeah. So who knows? But in any case, in or out of Congress, he was just one of the most effective people ever.
Do you think that there's something that he could have done that would have enhanced his effectiveness as a political leader?
That would have made him more effective?
Yeah.
Yeah, living.
Yeah. More time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, he was a force of nature.
I wonder, in my own personal understanding of politics, it has always struck me that you, as a thinker and an intellectual and academic, are sort of blessed with a righteous sort of moral compass, something, and while that's wonderful in a lot of ways, it may not have made you the best politician.
Oh, I see, because it's a burden. You're weighed down by commitments to ethics.
Exactly. I mean, many of the most successful politicians may be less burdened.
Well, yeah, but then what's the point?
Well, I wonder if he had been a bit less constrained by his scruples, he may have succeeded in more powerful positions.
Doesn't matter. Wouldn't have been him. And for people like Al and maybe myself, there's no point in doing it unless you're constrained by ethical principles. Anyway, I just want to tell one other Al story, which is not political. Just he went to University of North Carolina, and I was at some fundraising event for Al, when one of the speakers was a state legislator from North Carolina who had gone to college with Al.
Al went to college in North Carolina?
Yeah, he went to University of North Carolina, UNC at Chapel Hill.
Was he from the South?
No.
He's from New York?
But UNC was a very good school.
Very good school, yeah.
And this fellow was talking about Al. He said, pretty strong Southern accent. He says, first day of college, me and my buddies went out for a wrestling team. And the coach was a very informal guy, and he just pick any two guys and say, you two wrestle. And he matched me up with this skinny Yankee named Allard Lowenstein. And my buddies are standing around watching us and yelling, get him, Jed, get him, Jed. And get him, Jed. Al got me in that famous scissors hold of his, and get him, Jed was the last thing I remember hearing before I passed out.
Energetic in all instances, not just in political force.
But this guy, had met Al, probably 25 years earlier in college, and was still, loyal enough to come to a fundraiser for New York for him.
So, that story, in addition to the number of the other ones you've told, seemed to illustrate his, I asked you a question earlier about whether his political face and his personal face were really any different. And it seems because he had such a strong following, it was all just Al.
Yeah.
Night and day. He was the same guy. He was the same person.
I think so.
Yeah.
It was, anyway. It's my own story.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things in that post I was interested about, we have a bit more time, you discussed really briefly spending time in the Midwest during a campaign that you were involved in Indianapolis, living with Craig Sparks.
Well, Al sent me out there. He decided that first when I went to work for Al that summer, first I was helping to set up an anti-war rally in Mineola, where Peter, Paul, and Mary sang, and it was great. And that's where I met a young woman named Cecilia Gardner, actually, for the first time. Your mother. So I worked out of the Oceanside office, which was his, by the way, the only functioning ex-congressional office I ever heard of, which was, where he somehow raised funds to keep it going. And then registration summer was, as I mentioned, this effort to get 18-year-olds registered throughout the country. And he sent me out to Indiana to be the coordinator. And so I spent the month of July, basically, working out of the headquarters of Gordon St. Angelo, who was the state party chair in Indiana. Al set me up there, and living with Craig and Sherry Sparks, who were people, Al knew, my age, basically.
Yeah.
Wonderful people. I'm still close friends with Craig. So I just basically went all over Indiana, setting up registration drives, mostly in college campuses, which is actually pretty interesting. I did that for 1 month, and living in Indianapolis was different for me. I liked it a lot, actually.
What was so different?
Well, it's different from New York, and
well,
other than New York and Cambridge, where I hadn't lived anywhere else really. Indianapolis, New York is, as you know, very multi-ethnic, very multiracial, and so forth. Indianapolis is overwhelmingly white Protestant, although interestingly, obviously Gordon St. Angelo is not a waspy name, but there's actually, I learned that there's actually less ethnic consciousness in a sense. Nobody thought much of somebody being Italian American like Gordon.
Yes, but white.
Yeah, white. That's true. Although the other guy, the guy that came as my assistant that Al sent, was a black guy. Actually, at one point, Craig just brought us home to meet his folks, who did not live in Indianapolis, lived in Seymour, Indiana, which is a small town.
I've never heard of Seymour.
Small town, not too far from Indianapolis. But he told us, I don't know, he may well have been correct, that me and my buddy were respectively the first Jew and the first black to set foot in Seymour, Indiana. And we were greeted very cordially.
Were you?
Oh, yeah, sure. Everybody was very nice. And in Indianapolis, again, I thought the people were extremely nice. I liked everybody I met there.
Well, I'm interested because directly before describing your time in Indianapolis, you mentioned a moment as a child you spent in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Oh, yeah, but I spent 1 day or 2 days in Baton Rouge.
Yes, and I know that during that time, or you mentioned during that time that you were quite impacted by seeing the
whites only and colored only signs. It was very shocking to me. But I didn't see nothing like that in Indianapolis. I mean,
so I wonder why you speak of them in such proximity in your post.
Speak of which, the Baton Rouge and the Indiana?
Yeah.
Do I?
Yes, you do. Well, you mentioned that as being the two experiences as being really your only venture outside of the New York or the Boston D.C. corridor.
Yeah, at that time.
At that time, right?
Yeah, but they were very, very different.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I mean, I was I guess it wasn't that many years later, but there was I was in Baton Rouge in 62, before the Civil Rights Movement, before all the big changes. By the time I was in Indianapolis, the country had changed. You know, and in any case, Indianapolis is. Louisiana and Indiana are pretty different. I say they're very different, although Indiana was where the Klan originated. And certainly there was some racist history there. But Indianapolis, at least my encounters there, were nothing like that. I mean,
and you spent a lot of time in college campuses in Indiana.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I mean, maybe the people that I encountered wouldn't be like that, but I didn't encounter any prejudice or anything like that.
So you characterize your time there as favorable?
Oh, it was great.
Yeah,
loved it. Absolutely loved it.
Great.
But then Al called me back because Harriet Eisman, who was the woman who ran his congressional and then ex-congressional office, needed a vacation, so he had me run the ex-congressional office for the following month, and it was unbelievable. There were papers and boxes and things like stacked up so high you couldn't move in that place. And Allard said, "Don't throw anything away." Well, I went through all those papers and I hired a truck and I took them all to the dump.
Oh, gosh.
And we came back. At first he was shocked, and then he said, "I guess you did the right thing." I mean, you couldn't work. It was crazy. He had Al was wonderful and brilliant and energetic and great. But he kept such a cluttered mess in his office that you couldn't do anything.
So you can credit yourself with sort of cleaning up
the ex-congressional. Yes, I did. I mean, I did a lot of other things because he was working on a million projects, which I had to do things to prepare. But it was just a great experience. It was really wonderful working for him.
Do you have a sort of capstone story that?
No, not really. I mean, the real story is that Ted Kennedy story.
Yeah.
He's a member of Congress, Al, but he knows who you are.
So Al Lowenstein is sort of a singular defying the roles of what's important in the political sphere.
Well, in some ways it was that the Kennedy story was an important lesson for me, which is you don't have to be in elective office to define yourself. So,
you don't have to be in elected office to affect change.
Right.
To do good things.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like he taught you a great deal.
Oh, yeah. But I think, those all of his characteristics together for me were just the ideal. I mean, it could have been a little less cluttered. But actually, the fact that he always looked rumpled and slept in his suits and that stuff, that didn't bother me at all. I kind of identified with that. So.
Please don't sleep in your suits.
No. So, I wonder if maybe I said I'd do this in a later podcast, but maybe it wouldn't be such a bad lead-in if I do it now. If I talk about the 1972 race where Al ran against John Rooney. And what I'll say about that is this. I went, obviously after, let me backtrack. After working for Al at that point in Indiana, I go back to law school for my second year, and I get a call from a fellow named Louis Boquette in the Lindsay presidential campaign, asking me if I would help out. And I said, "Well, I've just been working in Indiana. Maybe I know he's going to want to have some advance work there for the primary that's coming up in the spring. How about I go down to back to Indiana, and do some advance work for Lindsay there?" And he said, "Oh yeah, absolutely." So in October, when of course I was supposed to be in law school, I was actually in Indiana preparing, doing the advance work. That's a political specialty. Advance work means you make all the preparations for the candidate's appearance. So for complicated reasons, I think it was the politics of the mayor. In any case, Lindsay couldn't, they wouldn't allow Lindsay to make his big rally in Indianapolis. It had to be at the airport, which is quite a distance from Indianapolis. So it was my job to make sure that there was a large crowd at the airport to greet him when he came in. I think, if I remember correctly, the mayor of Indianapolis was favorably inclined toward Lindsay, but Ed Muskie was the front runner, and the Democratic organization was mostly going to support Muskie. So he would annoy the establishment if he set up something for Lindsay in Indianapolis. But the mayor's office was working with us to set up the event at the airport. Mm-hmm. Working with us in the sense that they gave me phone numbers of people to call, things like that. So I had spoken with some unions who sent people, some college campuses. We got some buses to bring students down, and so on and so forth. But it was a lot of work. I mean, setting up a decent crowd is quite a bit of work.
Especially at an airport.
Especially at an airport, which is quite a ways from
the
city. And so I remember there was a fellow named Walter Hinckley who was sort of supervising me from afar, and he, I don't know what was wrong with him, but he was obnoxious, and he kept like pushing me. Oh. And I said at one point, Walter, you do that one more time and I'll be in jail and you'll be in the hospital. But in any case, a bunch of people who had committed to send people for me didn't send them, but I had enough backup, so we had a good crowd anyway. Mm. And so then Lindsay landed and did the event at the airport, and then I accompanied Lindsay for the next few days at other stops in Indiana. We were flying around in a Learjet, which is a little jet with about 6 seats. And basically Lindsay, me, and a couple of other aides were in the jet. So I really, got to spend time with the guy. And I remember that I was operating on like 4 hours of sleep a night. And I was okay somehow. And then it occurred to me that I really ought to open up the, corporations. I didn't bring the casebook, the big fat law casebook that I was supposed to be studying, but the Gilbert's Law Outlines, which was like the cheat sheet.
The Spark Notes, yeah.
So I finally opened it up, and for the first time fell asleep.
Not your typical law student.
No. Anyway, but that was, and Lindsay was amazing. He would be going like me from like 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. And then at 1 a.m, there'd be a bunch of reporters, and he'd do a press thing with the reporters and be funny and witty and terrific. And, I'd get him into his bedroom and he'd collapse. But, that's when I saw for the first time how skinny he was.
Oh, yeah.
Like, he was one of the best looking men ever. But thin like a rail. Like
well, if you're working that hard.
Yeah, but naturally. He was tall. He was 6'4".
Oh, wow.
Very, very thin. Anyway, so I was working did advanced work for Lindsay. And then I went back to law school after that. And then in the spring, did advanced work for him. No, not advanced work at that point. Actual campaign work in Miami. Mm-hmm. Which turned out to be pretty much the end of his campaign. He had annoyed enough New Yorkers who moved to Florida that he did terribly. Yeah. And basically ended the campaign. We may be going over, so
we are a bit, yeah.
Cut this into segments. Yeah. But the other thing that I left out was that when I was the Massachusetts coordinator for Lindsay also, and when I got back from Indiana, I became Massachusetts coordinator for the Lindsay Presidential. I was, as a law student, I was kind of an amateur. Eventually, a professional named John Martilla took over, but I was the temporary coordinator. And in so doing, at that time, my theory was that, obviously Muskie was going to get the nomination, but somebody like Lindsay could attract enough support to sort of push Muskie to the left. So I went over to Smith College to try to enlist a student leader there to support Lindsay. Who had a different theory. She didn't think Lindsay would do very well, and she didn't even think Muskie was going to get the nomination. She was supporting this real far-out candidate named George McGovern. In fact, she was the New England coordinator, became the New England coordinator for George McGovern. So I did not persuade her to join the Lindsay campaign. That also was Cecilia Gardner, your mother. So, anyway, so then in, I guess it was March, I got down to Florida. Again, I'm supposed to be at law school. What was the name of that college? A little college in Miami where we tried to recruit volunteers. Anyway, there's a woman whose name I still remember, only because her name was so unusual. Cookie Mello.
Wow.
Was a college student there who we tried to recruit. I had no money, so someone had given us a case of some kind of pink champagne or something. And I was basically living on that stuff for a few weeks down there. It was really horrible. Had no money at all. And but I had driven down there. No, I don't know how I may have flown down, but I drove back when it was over with geez, I'm forgetting his name. He's a Leo Goldstein. Leo Goldstein was a Hungarian refugee who had worked for Lindsay and he had been a soccer coach and player. He did sports stuff, for kids in the Lindsay administration, and he insisted on doing all the driving. He wouldn't let me drive from New York to Florida, and we drove almost straight through. We'd stop, in a motel or something. But I just remember Leo very quietly, when he thought I was leaving every night, he would just say, "God bless America." He was, having lived through the Nazis and the communists, he was very grateful to be here. Anyway, so came back and went back to law school, and then I got 2 phone calls. One was from Liz Holtzman saying, "Dan, I'd like you to help out in my congressional campaign. I'm running against Emanuel Seller." Emanuel Seller had been a member of the House of Representatives for about 50 years. He was, he was considered the dean of the House of Representatives. He'd been there forever, represented the same district in Brooklyn. He was actually a great civil rights champion, but at this point he was in his 80s. He was not good on women. He was opposed the ERA. He was not good on women's issues. And he was practicing law with a sign. It was unclear which was the law practice and which was the congressional. There's at that point some ethical issues. Yeah. But Seller was this pillar of Washington, and so I got another call from Allard Lowenstein saying he's running against John Rooney, also in a different district in Brooklyn. And I analyzed the situation as follows: Al's going to win anyway. Yeah, the whole world supports Al. Poor Liz is going to get demolished by Seller, and but if I help her, maybe she'll get 18% instead of 12%. So I'll help Liz. It's my usual brilliant political calculation.
Shoot for the underdog.
Right. As it turned out, of course, everybody else made the same calculation. So Meade Esposito, the county chair, sent all of his troops to help Rooney. Nobody thought Liz was a threat. Everybody thought Seller would have a walkover. So they made the same calculation that I did, but they played it differently. Their thing was, well, let's make sure that Rooney wins. We're not worried about Seller. Of course, as it turns out, things turned out somewhat differently, but that's another story. So we'll save that.
Okay. Well, that was a good bit. I think we're going to close up shop there for now, and we will rejoin you on your adventures in the political sphere of New York after the confluence of Liz and Al's consequential defeats and victories. Well, thank you very much. I hope you all join us for our next podcast. Dan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
We will see you again on our next episode of A Good Run. Thanks.